The cold wind cut through the city streets as Mia hurried on her usual walk to work. It was one of those mornings where the world seemed gray and indifferent. Her mind was preoccupied with the usual concerns, meetings, reports, deadlines, each one more pressing than the last. But then something caught her eye. Near a forgotten corner of the street, a small, scruffy dog was rummaging through a pile of discarded food. His fur was a tangled mess of dirt and matted strands, and his eyes held a look of resignation, as if he had long since accepted the fact that life had no mercy for him. Mia's heart twisted at the sight. She had seen strays before, but something about this dog struck her deeply. He was different. She could tell that he hadn't just been abandoned recently. He had lived a life of hardship, a life of survival. His small, fragile body looked like it had been through too many winters and too many hunger-filled days. She stopped, uncertain. Her fingers clutched the strap of her bag, as though searching for an answer within the folds of the fabric. Mia wasn't sure what she could do for this dog, but she knew she couldn't walk away. He hadn't noticed her yet, his focus entirely on the scraps before him. She took a deep breath, hesitated, then pulled out her sandwich. It wasn't much, just a plain turkey and cheese, but it was something. She crouched down slowly, trying to make her movements less threatening, and held out the small piece of bread. At first, the dog froze. His eyes flicked to her hand, then back to the food, as if unsure whether to trust her. She could see the internal battle behind his wary gaze. He wanted to eat, but he had learned long ago that food wasn't always freely given. "Come on," Mia whispered softly, her voice barely a murmur. "It's okay." He took a tentative step forward, his paws shuffling in the dirt. Then, ever so carefully, he snatched the food from her hand. Mia watched as he devoured it quickly, his tiny body shaking from the cold as he ate. She sat there, frozen in place, just watching him. A small part of her couldn't help but wonder. What had happened to him? Who had he been before this? Was he lost, or had he always been alone? Mia's thoughts drifted back to her own life. She had moved to the city for work years ago, and despite being surrounded by people, she often felt isolated, as though she was a mere observer in the lives of those around her. The quiet mornings, the routine, sometimes it felt as if she were drifting through life without ever truly connecting with anyone. But this dog, this stray, was different. The simple act of sharing her food with him, of seeing the raw need in his eyes, made her feel more alive than she had in a long time. It wasn't just about the food. It was about connection. It was about reaching out to something beyond herself, offering help in a world that often felt indifferent to the suffering of others. The following days felt different. Mia couldn't stop thinking about the stray dog. She found herself watching for him as she walked to work, hoping to see him again, hoping that maybe he had survived another night on the cold streets. It didn't take long before she saw him again, this time a few streets over, near an old bookstore. He was eating from a discarded carton of food, and when he heard her footsteps, he turned his head cautiously. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Mia smiled, and this time, he didn't shy away. Day after day, she came back to see him, bringing him bits of food, sometimes leftovers from her own meals, sometimes something extra she bought from a cafe. Gradually, she began to notice small changes in his behavior. The initial wariness was still there, but now, instead of running off at the first sign of her approach, he would wait, watching her from a distance. Mia didn't force him to come closer. She simply sat a few feet away from him, offering food, letting him decide how much to trust her. Slowly, that trust began to build. She learned to recognize the slight wag of his tail when he was satisfied, and she took it as a victory each time. Every day, it felt like a small step forward, a quiet promise that something good could happen, even in a city full of strangers. She named him Charlie. It felt right, as though he had always been Charlie, waiting for her to notice him, just as she had been waiting for him to come into her life. One evening, as she walked toward the familiar alley where she usually found him, Mia felt a strange sense of urgency in her chest. Something was wrong. Charlie wasn't there. She checked the nearby corners, her heart pounding faster with each empty street she turned down. No sign of him. The dread began to settle in her stomach. It wasn't like him to disappear. Was he hurt? Was he in danger? Mia's thoughts raced, and before she realized it, she was running, calling his name, her voice growing frantic. She rounded a corner, then another, but still there was no sign of him. She felt a cold sweat on her forehead, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. It wasn't until she reached a dark alley that she heard it. A faint whimper. Her heart skipped a beat. She rushed toward the sound, her mind racing with possibilities. There in the shadows beneath a broken-down fence, she found him, Charlie, trembling, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. "Oh my God, Charlie," Mia whispered, kneeling beside him. She reached out slowly, not wanting to hurt him more, and gently touched his injured leg. He whimpered in pain, and her heart shattered. She knew what she had to do. She had to get him help. Mia's mind was a blur as she carefully lifted Charlie into her arms. She had no idea what to do or where to take him, but she knew she couldn't leave him there. He was depending on her now. She ran toward the nearest vet clinic. Her legs were aching, but the weight of Charlie's small body was a constant reminder that she couldn't stop. The clinic was just a few blocks away, but it felt like a lifetime. She arrived breathless, her arms trembling as she held Charlie against her chest. The receptionist, seeing the state of the dog, quickly ushered her in. Mia barely registered the vet's words as she heard the costs of the surgery Charlie would need. She wasn't prepared for this. She didn't have enough money. The number seemed impossibly high, more than she had saved in all her years working in the city. But she couldn't walk away from Charlie, not when he needed her. She felt a sense of desperation that she hadn't experienced before. How could she leave him in pain? Without thinking, Mia pulled out her phone. She created a crowdfunding page, explaining Charlie's story. She shared his picture, a photo of him sitting by the trash, looking up at her with those big, sad eyes, and hoped, prayed, that someone would help. Days passed, and Mia spent every moment by Charlie's side. The surgery was successful, but his recovery was slow. He was still weak, and for a long while, he could barely move. Mia stayed close, caring for him, feeding him, and offering him comfort. It wasn't long before she noticed a change in him. The trust he had begun to develop was becoming something more. Charlie, once so wary of human touch, now sought her out, nuzzling her hand or resting his head on her lap as she sat beside him. His healing wasn't just physical. With each day, his spirit seemed to come back to life. His eyes became brighter, and his small body began to regain strength. It was a slow process, but every little milestone felt like a victory. But Mia wasn't prepared for the news that came just a few weeks later. She had been feeling tired for a while, but she chalked it up to stress and the late nights spent caring for Charlie. However, when she went for a routine checkup, the results came back. She was diagnosed with a serious illness. For a moment, the world seemed to crash around her. The doctor's voice was distant, muffled, as her mind raced. How could this be happening now? She couldn't afford the treatments. She couldn't even take care of herself properly, let alone Charlie. Charlie, sensing her distress, padded over to her side, nuzzling her gently with his nose. The simple gesture broke something inside her. As Mia began her treatments, it wasn't just the doctors and nurses who helped her get through it. It was Charlie, who remained by her side every step of the way. His loyalty, his unconditional love, gave her the strength to keep going. Every day she woke up for him. Every moment of pain was eased by his presence. The journey was long and difficult, but eventually, Mia began to heal. And as she recovered, so did Charlie. Together, they became an inseparable pair, two lost souls who had found each other in the darkest of times. Mia knew, deep in her heart, that Charlie had saved her just as much as she had saved him. Months later, Mia stood on stage at a charity event, telling Charlie's story. Her voice was steady, filled with gratitude, as she spoke about the kindness of strangers, the power of love, and the unexpected healing that had taken place in her life. Charlie sat beside her, his tail wagging gently as the audience clapped. Mia smiled through her tears. She had never imagined that a stray dog would change her life in such a profound way. But now, looking at Charlie, she realized that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come from the places we least expect.